Today I wanted to discuss the best survival crops for you to look into planting in the following upcoming year. Now, being the middle of December, you may think this is a little bit early to be thinking about that, but the reason why I'm talking about it is because for the last few years, a lot of the seed companies have been selling out of these varieties very early on in the year, like late February, they're completely out. So I wanted to give you guys a little bit of time to think this over, maybe do a little more research and still have time to go purchase some of these seeds if you want to. Now you can always go to the big box stores year round and they'll have those kiosks set out with the genetically modified seeds that come from the big genetics companies. But I think people are waking up to the need for using open pollinated heirloom seeds, especially after all the lies we've been told over the last few years. I think people want to source their seed from a seed company, not a genetics company. So basically there's two types of crops that are commonly grown domestically. You have ones that can contain high amounts of macronutrients and then ones that contain micronutrients. Now, most of the gardening people do when they first get into it, tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, the easier things to do, they're in the micronutrient category, as in they give you a lot of vitamins and minerals, but they're kind of lacking in the macros, which is your protein, fats, and carbs. So I'm not saying it's bad to grow micronutrients. If you already do your tomatoes and cucumbers and peppers and you do that as a thing for making your salsa or whatever, that's great. I mean, whatever you're growing, keep at it. Don't let me discourage you. But I'm going to kind of focus on some macronutrient crops because you can have an entire field of tomatoes and cucumbers and still starve to death because you're not getting any fats or proteins out of that. So these will be in no particular order, but starting off, I would say a very good one is field corn. Now notice I said field corn and not sweet corn. Sweet corn is what people plant to get those corn on the cob that you like. But field corn is different. That's what's grown as a feed. It's usually ground up into like cornmeal and then put up to make corn products. That's what you're looking for is field corn. Usually the varieties of seed are labeled as dent or flint are the most common types of field corn. Unlike the sweet corn, which would be in the micro category, the field corn is in the macro category. Along with that is beans. Bush bean or pole bean, doesn't matter. Whatever type you happen to like is good. One thing I have a difficult time with, I'm actually allergic to beans. They're in the legume family. So beans, peas, and peanuts, all the same family. So I can actually eat green beans because what green beans are is premature beans. So they're picked, the green beans are picked before the beans have had a chance to mature. And when they go to seed and they harden up into that hard bean that you got to cook up, that's when they develop the protein. And usually those food allergies come from the proteins in a food is what you're allergic to. So for me, I'm allergic to that protein in legumes, and a lot of people are. So I can eat it prematurely before it's matured, but then once it's matured and become a hard bean, I can't. So I still grow it because I like the green beans. They're delicious. But I also recognize that those beans are an excellent survival food, full of the fats and proteins like we're talking about. So somebody can always eat it. The third one would be squash, specifically winter squash. Um, the difference between a summer squash and a winter squash basically is that summer squashes are ones that taste best when they're harvested prematurely, whereas winter squashes are best when they're harvested later in the season. And the winter squashes will hold better over the winter as well. They've got a harder rind on them and will hold longer. So, I mean, you can grow a winter squash and harvest it early as you would a summer squash. It's just maybe not as flavorful as a summer squash type would be. But try both. But I would suggest winter squash is the way to go. And you notice the first three I mentioned, the field corn, beans, and squash, are what the Native Americans called the three sisters. Native Americans were typically thought of, most people think of them as like a hunter-gatherer, but they actually collected seeds, and wherever they would move to for their hunting and foraging purposes, they would plant those three plants because they just work so well together. The beans are a nitrogen fixer, so they add nitrogen to the soil while they will grow up the stalks of the corn. So the corn provides a stable pole for the beans to grow up on, and then the squash creates a nice leafy ground cover. So the soil always does better when it's covered. You never want just pure bare soil. That's never good. So having a good ground cover. So those three sisters are really excellent choices. The Native Americans also would plant a fourth crop, sunflower varieties. Now what they would do is plant the fields full of the three sisters, and then on the north end of it, they would plant the sunflowers. Because the sunflowers grow tall, they didn't want them shading the other ones, so they would stay on the north end of the field. Sunflowers are great too. Again, full of fats. Not a bunch of yield from it, but it's high nutritional value from it. And then I would add potatoes. Now, depending where you live, like people in tropical, subtropical, very southern environments, they seem to do better with sweet potatoes and yams than Irish potatoes. But whatever works in your growing area is good to go with. Again, something you can survive off of those potatoes. So that's 5. And an additional one I would talk about along in this same category would be chickens. It's the only animal I'm going to list. I think they are the most valuable for survival purposes. Having had them for years, what they provide and how little work you've got to put into them, they are worth it. So if you can grow enough of those 5 macronutrient crops to feed yourself and your chickens, you can survive just off of that. And then as far as like micronutrients go, you can always forage other edible foods for that. Like you can go back to, I have a video on the 5 best books for wild edible plants. I would start there looking at that. And then in addition to those survival crops, the other thing I would add would be perennial plants. Okay, and the reason is that perennial plants, unlike annuals which have to reseed each year, the perennials will keep coming back year after year. So they're so fantastic because they require so little input from you. Fruit and nut trees. I mean, you plant them once, you probably kind of got to baby them for the first year or two, but then after that, they grow all on their own and very little work each year before they start producing. Now, it'll be some years before they produce, but yeah, the best time to plant a tree was 10 years ago. The second best time to plant it is today. It reminds me of it's an old Japanese proverb that said, society grows great when old men plant trees whose shade they know they will never be able to sit in. So I had an apricot tree in my old yard that was mature, and it was borderline for northern Illinois. It would flower very early, and then if there happened to be an early frost, it would totally kill it off. Like there would be no yield that year whatsoever. But then some years it would do really well. And what was nice about it was it took about maybe an hour of pruning a year. That was all the work I had to do to that tree. And in return, it would give me all of these apricots. Now you think about it, that 1 hour a year, if instead you'd went to a job, let's say you make $30 an hour at your job. Well, after you pay for taxes, Social Security, Medicare, union dues, all that garbage, you're walking away with about 2/3 of what you made. So you're probably walking away with about $20 for that 1 hour of work. Well, over the course of the year, I would get way more than $20 worth of apricots off that tree. If I had to buy that many apricots out of the store, it'd probably be over $100 worth. So yeah, money does grow on trees when you're talking about fruit and nut trees. Berry bushes go along in the same vein. I had a raspberry patch, which again, it was each spring there would be two types of shoots sticking out. After all the leaves and everything go away for the winter, in the spring, you would have brown branches and gray branches. So the brown branches are in their second year. They will be producing fruit that year. So you left those alone. But the gray ones were going into their third year and would not fruit or would produce very little fruit. So what you would do is you would cut those gray ones, get rid of them, so that all of the energy of the plants goes to that second year shoots and the new growth, which will too produce fruit. So whatever kind of berries grow well in your environment, look into that. Again, very simple. That was about an hour of work a year for that whole raspberry patch. And for about 2 or 3 months out of the year, every time I'd walk outside with Brute, I can just go and eat a handful of raspberries all day long. It was awesome. And there are some perennial vegetables as well. I think probably the most commonly known ones would be asparagus, rhubarb, and maybe Egyptian walking onion, some people are familiar with. Uh, Again, these take time, like asparagus. I've known of some people that can get able to harvest food from it in the first year, but usually it takes like 2 or 3 years before you can harvest from it. So the perennial idea is something that it's not going to give you food immediately this year, but it's something that you start planting the seeds now so that down the line, years from now, you're getting food that's just easy. You just got to do the work of going out there and just collecting it. So that would be my list of survival crops that I would focus on. The perennial plants, fruit and nut trees. I plan out here, even though I have no shortage of trees, every year I am going to be planting more of them. Even if I can just only afford 1 or 2 fruit or nut trees, I'm going to be adding them. Berry bushes, perennial vegetables, and then your staple crops, the squash, beans, and field corn, potato, whatever potato type grows best for you, the sunflowers, and then chickens. Chickens are your animal you want. What's nice about the sunflowers too is that when you harvest the heads, you can actually just put the heads away for the winter with all the seeds in it. And as long as you can keep rodents and stuff out of it, throughout the winter, you can throw them to your chickens. You can just take that head full of seed and just throw it out to the chickens. And throughout the winter, when they're having a tough time foraging for food, you're giving them a nice fatty seed to eat. So That's where I'd start. Look into it. These seed companies sell out the really good ones online and that early. So look into it if you want to get these varieties. Uh, People are starting to wake up to the need for heirloom varieties. Ideally, what I think, my opinion on gardening and experience is that what you want to do is get multiple varieties of heirlooms of a certain type. Like say squashes, have a number of squashes you get that are heirlooms. And you, in the first year, just plant them all and see what survives and work on saving those seeds. The heirlooms you can actually will be uh, able to save the seeds and then replant them the next year, unlike a lot of the genetically modified seeds. So you save the seeds that survive, and each year work on then allowing them to hybridize and adapt to your environment, because growing here in Arkansas is going to be different than growing back in Illinois or growing in the Pacific Northwest or Florida. I mean, everywhere is different. So you want to work on eventually breeding your seeds to adapt to your local environment, to your local pests and conditions, and that will allow you to develop and breed your own strains that are perfect for your area.